So within my own art practice, I started engaging with text and image and how they interact and coexist, and how they might kind of inform one another without one dominating the other. So that trying to understand how a text can serve a photograph without it necessarily just being a caption or a description of that photograph, and how a photograph might serve a text in terms of allowing that text to be interpreted or understood in various different ways through visual means. And I studied the history of art at the same time I was studying photography, so I'm very much interested in kind of the history of art and how that informs photographic language and visual culture. Also, cinema is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, particularly in terms of how image and narrative work together, and again, text, sound, and image interacting and engaging. And then also in my most recent book, which is called Sonata, I used musical composition and music theory as a way of thinking about how to structure a book that has not necessarily a narrative, but a sequence that follows along the lines of the sonata form in classical music. So I think one good example of that is the kind of change that's occurred over the last 20 or 30 years, but particularly within the last 10 years, where I think text was at one point very dominant in terms of carrying information, and quite often the photograph was simply an illustration that would accompany that text. And I think now that we exist in a world that's dominated by social media and online engagement, quite often the image comes first. So for example, on Instagram, you have the image and the text is almost kind of serves as a background or a kind of secondary aspect of that information. So you're encountering an image first rather than the text. And I think that's an interesting way in which the language is changing, and it seems to be developing a little bit further in that direction, where people are consuming and absorbing images and then hopefully using text to enrich their experience of that and their understanding of those images, rather than the other way around. I mean, there's lots of changes happening within photographic culture. So the idea of the photojournalist is changing dramatically, particularly with citizen journalism and everybody having cameras. Quite often the images that we see now were taken by people who were standing at the scene rather than necessarily photojournalists. So yeah, I think the idea of how documentary photography is expanding into a medium that's a little bit more like long-form subjective journalism that was occurring maybe in the 1960s or 70s, that kind of idea of a subjective voice engaging with an experience and an event, but through their own kind of subjective eye. So rather than pretending that the camera is this objective fly on the wall, it's actually a tool through which people can express their own engagement and interaction with whatever is happening in front of them or in the news or otherwise. Yeah.